I was standing on my dock at Lake Norman, North Carolina, watching the sunrise paint the water gold when I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. My boathouse stood proudly at the end of the pier, exactly 23 feet tall from the waterline to the peaked roof, housing my fishing boat and kayaks. I had spent 3 years planning it, 6 months getting permits from both the county and the HOA, and $40,000 building it to exact specifications. Every single regulation had been met. "Andrew Garrison?" The voice belonged to a woman in her late 40s with severely highlighted blonde hair and a clipboard clutched like a weapon. "I'm Patricia Summers, president of the Waterside Estates Homeowners Association." I turned from the water, already sensing trouble. "That's me. What can I do for you?" Patricia's eyes were hidden behind oversized sunglasses despite the early hour, but her mouth was set in a thin line of disapproval. "Your boathouse violates HOA regulations. Section 12, subsection 4 states that all waterfront structures must not exceed 20 feet in height." My stomach dropped. "That's incorrect. I have the approved plans right here in my house. The regulation is 25 feet and my boathouse is 23 feet. I can show you the documentation." "The regulations were updated 6 months ago," Patricia said, her voice clipped. "All residents were notified by email." I never received any email. I pulled out my phone, already scrolling through my inbox. "When exactly was this sent?" "That's not my problem, Mr. Garrison. The fact remains that your structure is now in violation. You have 30 days to bring it into compliance or face penalties." I found nothing in my email, not in spam, not anywhere. 30 days to do what exactly? Lower a boathouse that's already built? That's your concern, not mine. Patricia turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and the daily fine for non-compliance is $200. The HOA board will be voting on your case at next month's meeting." She walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there with a growing sense of dread. I immediately went inside and pulled up every document related to my boathouse construction. The original HOA architectural review application, approved unanimously. The building permits from Iredell County. The final inspection reports. Everything clearly stated the height limit was 25 feet. I spent the next hour on the phone with my lawyer, Marcus Chen, who had handled my real estate closing. He listened carefully as I explained the situation. "Did you ever receive written notice of any regulation changes?" Marcus asked. Nothing, and I checked my email going back a year. There's no notification about height restrictions changing." "That's interesting. North Carolina law requires HOAs to provide proper notice of covenant changes, typically 30 days minimum, with written documentation sent via certified mail or hand delivery. Email alone usually isn't sufficient for major changes. So what do I do?" First, request copies of all documentation showing when and how this regulation was changed, board meeting minutes, the vote count, proof of notification. Second, show up at that board meeting prepared. Third, don't let them intimidate you into making any modifications until this is sorted out. I thanked Marcus and hung up, then immediately drafted an email to Patricia requesting all the documentation he had mentioned. I sent it certified through the HOA's online portal, making sure there was a timestamp and receipt confirmation. 2 days later, I received a response. It wasn't from Patricia, but from the HOA's secretary, a man named Donald Werther. The email was brief and unhelpful. "Regulation changes are posted on the community website. Please review at your convenience." I logged into the Waterside Estates HOA website, something I admittedly rarely did. The site was poorly designed and difficult to navigate. After 20 minutes of clicking through outdated newsletters and archived meeting minutes, I found a document dated 8 months prior titled Proposed Amendments to Architectural Guidelines. The document was 43 pages long. Buried on page 27 was a single line. Waterfront structure height restrictions reduced from 25 feet to 20 feet. But this was labeled as proposed. I searched for any documentation showing this had been voted on and approved. Nothing. I downloaded every board meeting minute from the past year and found no record of any vote on this amendment. Armed with this information, I called Marcus back. They never actually approved the change. It was only proposed. "Even better," Marcus said. "That means your boathouse was and still is in compliance. Send them a formal letter stating this. I'll draft it for you." The letter went out the next day via certified mail and email. I felt confident that this would resolve the issue. I was wrong. A week later, I returned home from my job as a civil engineer at a construction firm in Charlotte to find my gate access card deactivated. I had to buzz the guardhouse, where a young security officer I didn't recognize looked uncomfortable as he explained that my access had been temporarily suspended due to HOA violations. I parked on the street outside the community and walked the half-mile to my house, furious. This was beyond harassment. I called Marcus immediately. "They can't do that," he said flatly. "That's restricting your access to your own property. We're filing an injunction first thing tomorrow morning." But when I reached my house, something far worse awaited me. The dock was empty. My boathouse was gone. Completely gone. Only splintered pilings remained where it had stood that morning. I stood there in shock, unable to process what I was seeing. $40,000 of structure demolished. My fishing boat, 2 kayaks, and thousands of dollars in equipment had been inside. All gone. My hands shook as I dialed 911. "I need to report a crime. Someone destroyed my property." The Iredell County Sheriff's deputy who arrived 30 minutes later was a tall man in his 50s named Officer Daniels. He surveyed the destruction with a grim expression. "Any idea who did this?" "The HOA," I said. "They've been threatening me about the height of the boathouse, but I was in compliance. I have all the documentation." Officer Daniels took detailed notes and photographs. "Where's your boat and equipment?" "It was all inside the boathouse." My voice cracked. "That's probably $60,000 in total damages, not counting sentimental value." "We'll need to investigate. Do you have security cameras?" I did, but they faced the street in front of the house, not the waterfront. "No coverage of the dock." "I'll file a report, but you should contact your insurance company and a lawyer. If the HOA did this without proper legal process, that's destruction of property." After Officer Daniels left, I walked down to the water's edge. Debris floated everywhere. Pieces of siding, insulation, roofing shingles. In the fading light, I spotted something in the water and waded in to retrieve it. My grandfather's vintage tackle box, crushed but recognizable. He had given it to me before he died, and it had been displayed on a shelf in the boathouse. I sat down right there in the shallows and felt tears of rage and grief burning my eyes. Marcus arrived within the hour, having dropped everything to drive up from Charlotte. He documented everything with his phone, taking hundreds of photos and videos. "This is beyond illegal. This is criminal. They can't just demolish someone's property." Who do I even sue? The HOA? Patricia individually? Potentially both. But first, let's find out exactly who authorized this. Marcus was already on his phone, calling someone. "I'm getting in touch with a colleague who specializes in property law. This is going to be a significant case." Over the next 3 days, I barely slept. I filed police reports, insurance claims, and demand letters. Marcus filed an emergency injunction against the HOA, preventing any further action against my property. We also filed a lawsuit against the HOA and Patricia Summers personally for destruction of property, trespass, and violations of North Carolina HOA statutes. The local news picked up the story. A reporter named Jennifer Walsh from the Charlotte Observer came out to interview me and photograph the destruction. Her article ran on the front page of the local section. HOA demolishes residents' boathouse without warning. The story got traction. By the weekend, it had spread to regional news stations. I gave interviews to 3 different TV stations, each time explaining that I had followed every rule, obtained every approval, and had my property destroyed anyway. Then, the HOA responded. They issued a statement claiming I had been given multiple warnings and that the demolition was conducted in accordance with HOA covenants. They provided no evidence to support either claim. The court hearing for the injunction was scheduled 2 weeks after the demolition. Marcus and I arrived at the Iredell County Courthouse, prepared with binders full of documentation. Patricia Summers appeared with the HOA's attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit named Richard Voss. Judge Marion Blackwell, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, listened as both sides presented their arguments. Marcus methodically laid out the timeline, the approved plans, the lack of any valid regulation change, the destruction without notice or due process. Richard Voss argued that the HOA had broad authority to enforce regulations and that I had been adequately notified. When Judge Blackwell asked for proof of notification, Voss provided a single email sent to a community-wide distribution list 8 months prior. "And Mr. Garrison's name is on this distribution list?" Judge Blackwell asked. Voss hesitated. "It should have been." "That's not what I asked. Is his email address on the list you actually sent this to?" "I would need to verify with the HOA secretary." Judge Blackwell was not impressed. "So you demolished this man's $40,000 structure based on a regulation change he may never have been notified about, and you can't even confirm he was on the email list. Mr. Voss, this isn't just an HOA overreach. This is destruction of property." "Your Honor, if I may." "You may not. Injunction granted. The HOA is prohibited from taking any enforcement action against Mr. Garrison's property pending resolution of the underlying lawsuit. Furthermore, I'm ordering the HOA to provide full documentation of the demolition, including who authorized it, who performed it, and what happened to Mr. Garrison's personal property that was stored in the boathouse. You have 1 week." We left the courthouse cautiously optimistic, but I still had no boathouse, no boat, and no idea where my property had gone. The answer came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the hearing, I received a call from my neighbor, Howard Mitchell. Howard lived 4 houses down from me and had always been friendly but distant. We waved when we saw each other, occasionally chatted about the weather, but that was the extent of it. "Andrew, I need to talk to you about something," Howard said. "Can I come over?" "Sure, when?" "Now, if possible. It's important." Howard arrived 15 minutes later, looking uncomfortable. He was a retired accountant in his late 60s, and I had never seen him look this agitated. "I should have said something earlier," he began as we sat on my deck overlooking the empty dock. "But I was afraid of retaliation. After seeing what they did to you, though, I can't stay silent." "What are you talking about?" Howard took a deep breath. "Patricia Summers' son, Derek Summers, lives in Denver. He's moving back to North Carolina next month, and Patricia has been planning to sell him a property in this community. Not just any property, the premium lot at the north end of the lake. The Hendersons' old place." I knew the property he meant. 5 acres, huge lakefront, the best view in the community. "Okay, but what does that have to do with my boathouse?" 2 months ago, at a board meeting, Patricia proposed building a community recreation center on the waterfront of that property. It would include a large boathouse for community use, storage for boats, kayaks, paddleboards, the whole thing. The design she showed had the structure at 32 feet tall. My blood went cold. 32 feet. Right. Several board members pointed out that would violate the existing 25-foot height restriction. That's when Patricia started pushing to lower the restriction to 20 feet for residential structures, claiming it would preserve the aesthetic character of the waterfront. "So she could argue that the community boathouse was different," I said slowly, understanding dawning. "If residential structures were limited to 20 feet, but a community amenity could be taller, she could get approval for her son's property to have this massive boathouse." "Exactly. But here's the thing. The board never actually voted to approve the regulation change. Patricia just started enforcing it anyway. And your boathouse was the test case because you're the newest construction, the most visible, and you don't have any political connections in the community." "How do you know all this?" Howard looked embarrassed. "I'm on the Architectural Review Committee. I didn't vote for any of this. 3 of us opposed it, but Patricia railroaded it through anyway. She claimed she had board authority to make interim enforcement decisions pending formal approval. That's not how HOAs work. That's not how any of this works." "I know. That's why I'm here. I'll testify to all of this if it goes to court. I'm also resigning from the committee effective immediately. I want no part of what she's doing." I called Marcus immediately and put him on speaker. Howard repeated everything he had told me. Marcus was silent for a long moment after Howard finished. "This is conspiracy to commit fraud and illegal destruction of property," Marcus said. "If we can prove Patricia demolished Andrew's boathouse to clear the way for her own project, that's malicious prosecution and abuse of authority." "Howard, you said the premium lot was going to Patricia's son?" That's what she told the board. She said Derek was moving back to take a high-level job in Charlotte and wanted to live in the community where she's president. She made it sound like it would be good for property values to have a successful young professional in the neighborhood. "What does Derek do?" I asked. "Patricia calls him a tech entrepreneur. He founded some kind of app company in Denver. She's very proud of him, brings him up constantly." After Howard left, Marcus and I spent the next 2 hours researching Derek Summers. What we found was enlightening. Derek had indeed founded a tech company called Stream Connect, which developed social media management tools. The company had been moderately successful, raised several million in venture capital funding, but was now facing multiple lawsuits from former employees and investors alleging fraud and mismanagement. "So he's not quite the success story Patricia presents," Marcus observed, "and I bet that premium property purchase is being subsidized by Patricia herself. Can we use any of this?" "Not directly, but it establishes a pattern of deception and personal interest. Combined with Howard's testimony about the board meetings and the proposed community boathouse, we can show this was never about regulations or aesthetics. It was about Patricia abusing her HOA authority for her son's benefit." The discovery process for the lawsuit yielded even more damaging information. The HOA was required to turn over all documents related to the demolition. What we received was stunning. First, there was no work order, no formal authorization from the HOA board. Just an email from Patricia to a local demolition company, Riverside Demo Service, instructing them to remove the non-compliant structure at 847 Waterside Drive and billing it to the HOA's maintenance account. Second, the demolition company had not properly disposed of my boat and equipment. According to their invoice, they had been instructed to deliver all salvageable materials to 1203 Waterside Drive. I looked up that address. It was Patricia's house. Marcus literally laughed out loud when he saw that. "She stole your boat. she had them demolish your boathouse and deliver your boat and equipment to her own house. Andrew, this isn't just civil. This is criminal theft." I called Officer Daniels and provided him with the discovery documents. He came out the next day, took copies of everything, and said he'd be following up with the demolition company and Patricia. Meanwhile, the story was getting bigger. Jennifer Walsh wrote a follow-up article about the HOA's documents, showing Patricia had ordered the demolition without board approval and had my property delivered to her house. That article got picked up by the Associated Press. Suddenly, I was getting calls from news outlets across the country. A cable news network flew out a crew to do a longer piece on HOA overreach, using my case as the centerpiece. They interviewed me, Marcus, Howard, and several other Waterside Estates residents who had stories of Patricia's heavy-handed enforcement tactics. One couple had been fined $15,000 for painting their shutters the wrong shade of gray. Another resident faced daily fines for having a vegetable garden that Patricia deemed unsightly. The attention did something I hadn't expected. It mobilized the community. Residents who had been afraid to speak up suddenly found their voices. A petition started circulating to recall Patricia from the HOA board. Within a week, it had signatures from over 60% of the community. But Patricia wasn't backing down. Instead, she doubled down. The HOA filed a countersuit against me, claiming I owed over $20,000 in fines for the extended violation period of having an oversized boathouse. They also claimed I owed the cost of demolition, another $8,000. The case was scheduled for trial 4 months after the demolition. In that time, several things happened. Officer Daniels obtained a warrant and searched Patricia's property. They found my boat in her garage, along with my kayaks and most of my equipment. Patricia claimed she had been securing them until I paid my fines. She was arrested and charged with theft and receiving stolen property. The charges against Patricia made national news. The narrative of an HOA president gone rogue, demolishing a resident's property and stealing his boat, was too good for the media to resist. I did more interviews, talk shows, and podcasts than I could count. The story resonated because everyone seemed to have an HOA horror story. Derek Summers, facing his own legal troubles in Denver, quietly canceled his plans to move to North Carolina. The premium lakefront property sale fell through, and the proposed community boathouse project was indefinitely shelved. The HOA board, under immense pressure, voted to remove Patricia as president. She was replaced by a mild-mannered engineer named Robert Feldman, who immediately reached out to me to apologize for what had happened and to discuss a resolution. But I wasn't interested in a quiet settlement. This wasn't just about my boathouse anymore. It was about holding people accountable for abuse of power. The trial took 3 days. Marcus presented our case methodically. The approved plans, the lack of valid regulation change, the unauthorized demolition, the theft of property, and the evidence that Patricia had acted out of personal interest to benefit her son. The HOA's attorney, Richard Voss, tried to argue that Patricia had been acting in good faith to enforce community standards. It didn't go well. Judge Blackwell, the same judge who had granted our injunction, was presiding, and she wasn't having any of it. "Mr. Voss, your client demolished a man's property without authorization, stole his boat, and attempted to extort money from him through fraudulent fines. That's not enforcement of community standards. That's criminal behavior." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found in my favor on every count and awarded me $220,000 in damages, $40,000 for the boathouse, $20,000 for the boat and equipment, $10,000 for sentimental value of destroyed items, and $150,000 in punitive damages. Additionally, the jury found Patricia personally liable for $50,000 due to her willful misconduct and abuse of authority. Patricia's criminal trial came 2 months later. The theft charges were fairly straightforward. She had ordered my property delivered to her house and refused to return it. Her defense attorney tried to argue that she believed she had the authority to seize non-compliant property, but the prosecutor pointed out that even if that were true, which it wasn't, she had no right to take it to her personal residence. The jury convicted Patricia on 2 counts of theft and 1 count of abuse of authority. Judge Raymond Cooper sentenced her to 18 months in prison, suspended to 2 years of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service, and ordered her to pay full restitution for the value of the stolen property. The courtroom was packed with Waterside Estates residents. Some had come to support Patricia, but most were there to see justice served. When the sentence was read, I felt a wave of relief so intense I almost collapsed. Outside the courthouse, Jennifer Walsh was waiting with her camera crew. "Andrew, how does it feel to have this finally resolved?" "Exhausting," I said honestly. "Vindicating. But mostly I'm just glad it's over. No one should have to go through something like this just to enjoy their own property." "What's next for you?" "I'm rebuilding my boathouse. Same design, same height, completely legal. And I'm working with some state legislators on HOA reform legislation to prevent this from happening to anyone else." That last part was true. During the media coverage, I had been contacted by State Representative Elizabeth Monroe, who represented a district in Mecklenburg County. She had been working on HOA reform legislation for years and wanted to use my case as an example of why stronger oversight was needed. The bill we worked on, which eventually became known as the Homeowner Protection Act, required HOAs to provide documented proof of regulation changes, established a clear appeals process for violations, prohibited HOAs from taking enforcement action without board approval, and created penalties for HOA officials who abused their authority. It took 2 years, but the bill eventually passed. Governor Rachel Thornton signed it into law in a ceremony that I attended. It felt like a full-circle moment, turning something terrible into something that could protect other homeowners. Meanwhile, life at Waterside Estates slowly returned to normal. Robert Feldman proved to be a reasonable HOA president who actually followed the rules and treated residents with respect. Several of Patricia's more egregious enforcement actions were reversed, including the $15,000 fine for the wrong shade of gray shutters. Patricia herself largely disappeared from public view. She sold her house in Waterside Estates and moved to a condo in Charlotte. Her son Derek's company, Stream Connect, went bankrupt, and he ended up taking a regular job at a marketing firm in Boulder, Colorado. I felt no satisfaction in their misfortunes, just relief that they were no longer in a position to hurt anyone else. My new boathouse was completed 8 months after the trial. I had hired a different builder, an excellent crew who did meticulous work. The structure was identical to the original 23 feet tall, fully compliant with all regulations, and even more solidly built. I had invested in better security cameras this time, with complete coverage of the dock and boathouse. The day the construction was finished, I stood on my dock watching the sunset, just as I had been doing when Patricia first confronted me about the height violation. The new boathouse looked perfect, standing proud and legal at the end of my pier. I had bought a new boat, a beautiful 22-foot fishing boat that I christened the Perseverance. Howard Mitchell came down to check out the new structure. He had become a good friend through all of this, and I was grateful for his courage in coming forward with the truth about Patricia's schemes. "Looks great," Howard said, admiring the craftsmanship. "Better than the first one, honestly." "Should be, considering how much I spent on lawyers before I could even rebuild," Howard chuckled. "True. But hey, at least you got a decent settlement, and you changed the law for everyone else. Small consolation when I'm still paying off the legal bills." "Fair point." Howard paused, then said, "You know, a bunch of us were talking, and we want to start a residents association completely separate from the HOA. A group that actually represents homeowners' interests against HOA overreach. Would you be interested in being on the board?" I thought about it. Part of me wanted nothing to do with any kind of community governance after what I'd been through. But another part of me recognized the importance of good people staying engaged to prevent bad actors from taking over. Yeah, I said finally. "I'm in, but I'm not being president. I've had enough of being in the spotlight." "Deal. We'll make you treasurer. You're good with numbers, right?" "Close enough." Over the next year, the Waterside Estates Residents Association became a real force in the community. We provided oversight of the HOA board, advocated for residents facing unfair enforcement actions, and worked to make sure the community's finances were transparent and properly managed. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was important. I also stayed involved with HOA reform efforts at the state level. Representative Monroe invited me to testify before several legislative committees about my experiences. I spoke about the financial devastation of fighting an HOA with effectively unlimited resources, the emotional toll of having your home and property rights violated, and the need for meaningful accountability when HOA officials abuse their power. Some of the stories I heard from other homeowners were even worse than mine. People who had lost their homes over minor violations, elderly residents who had been harassed and fined into bankruptcy, families torn apart by the stress of fighting endless HOA battles. My case had gotten attention because it was dramatic and well documented, but it was just one example of a much larger problem. The media attention from my case led to several other high-profile HOA abuse cases being exposed and prosecuted. In Arizona, an HOA president was arrested for embezzling over $500,000 in community funds. In Florida, an entire HOA board was removed after they were found to be taking kickbacks from contractors. The spotlight on HOA misconduct was long overdue. As for me, I settled back into a quieter life. I spent weekends fishing from my new boat, kayaking in the early mornings, and enjoying the waterfront property I had worked so hard to keep. The lawsuit settlement, after legal fees and rebuilding costs, left me with enough to pay off a chunk of my mortgage and set aside an emergency fund. It wasn't wealth, but it was security. One afternoon, about 18 months after the trial, I was working on my boat when I heard footsteps on the dock. I turned to see a young woman, maybe 30 years old, with dark hair and an uncertain expression. "Andrew Garrison?" she asked. That's me. Can I help you?" "I hope so. My name is Bethany Kowalski. I live over in Lakeview Heights, the community across the lake. Our HOA is trying to fine us for installing solar panels on our roof. They say it violates the architectural guidelines, but the guidelines don't say anything about solar panels. We've been following your case, and I was hoping you might have some advice." I gestured for her to sit down on the dock. "Tell me everything." Bethany explained that she and her husband had installed solar panels 6 months earlier with proper county permits. The HOA had initially said nothing, but then a new board president had been elected who decided the panels were unsightly and violated the spirit of the architectural guidelines, even if they weren't explicitly prohibited. They were now facing $500 a day in fines, which had already reached $90,000. "Have you talked to a lawyer?" I asked. We met with one, but he wants a $20,000 retainer just to start, and we don't have that kind of money. We're both teachers. We got the solar panels specifically to save money on electricity. I thought for a moment. Okay, first thing, stop paying any fines. Don't acknowledge they're legitimate. Second, I'm going to connect you with Marcus Chen, my attorney. Tell him I sent you. He'll give you a fair price, and he knows this area of law inside and out. Third, document everything. Every communication with the HOA, every fine notice, all of it. We've been doing that, Bethany said. I have a folder with hundreds of emails and letters. Good. And fourth, don't be afraid to go public if you need to. The media attention in my case made a huge difference. HOAs hate bad publicity, and the court of public opinion matters. Bethany looked relieved. Thank you so much. I can't tell you how much this means. Just pay it forward. When this is over, help the next person who's getting screwed by their HOA. Bethany left with Marcus's contact information and a renewed sense of hope. I later learned that her case settled within 3 months. The HOA dropped all fines and amended their guidelines to explicitly allow solar panels, as required by North Carolina law. It turned out that several other residents had been wanting to install solar panels but were afraid of HOA retaliation. Once Bethany won her case, 6 more homes in Lakeview Heights added solar panels within a year. Stories like Bethany's kept finding me. I wasn't sure if it was because of the media coverage of my case or just the fact that HOA abuse was endemic, but I regularly heard from homeowners facing similar situations. I did what I could to help, offering advice, connecting people with lawyers, sharing strategies that had worked for me. It occurred to me that there needed to be a more organized resource for homeowners fighting HOA overreach. I wasn't a lawyer or a professional advocate, just someone who had been through the system and learned some things along the way. But maybe that perspective was valuable. I started a website called HOA Accountability Network. It was simple, just a collection of resources, information about homeowner rights, directories of lawyers who specialized in HOA cases organized by state, guides for documenting violations and building a case, and a forum where people could share their stories and advice. The site grew faster than I expected. Within 6 months, it had 10,000 registered users. Within a year, 50,000. People were desperate for information and support. The forum became a community of people sharing victories and setbacks, legal strategies, and moral support. I also started getting contacted by journalists and documentary filmmakers interested in the broader issue of HOA governance. I participated in a documentary called The Hidden Government: Inside America's HOAs, which premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and later aired on a major streaming platform. The documentary featured several stories of HOA abuse, including mine, and sparked a national conversation about the need for reform. That conversation led to congressional hearings. Representative Monroe, who had championed state-level HOA reform in North Carolina, was now working with federal legislators on potential nationwide protections for homeowners in HOA communities. I was invited to testify before a House subcommittee. Sitting in that hearing room in Washington, D.C., telling my story to members of Congress felt surreal. 3 years earlier, I had been a regular guy who just wanted to store his boat. Now I was part of a national movement to reform how millions of Americans' homes were governed. The federal legislation faced significant opposition from the HOA industry, which argued that federal oversight would interfere with private property rights and local governance. But the horror stories kept coming, and public pressure kept building. Eventually, a compromise bill passed that established minimum standards for HOA governance, required transparency in HOA finances, and created a federal complaint process for homeowners alleging civil rights violations by their HOAs. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and it wouldn't have happened without people being willing to stand up and fight back against abuse. Through all of this, I never stopped being grateful for my rebuilt boathouse and the peaceful life I had reclaimed on Lake Norman. Every morning I watched the sunrise over the water. I remembered how close I had come to losing it all. Not just the physical property, but the sense of security and peace that made a house feel like home. Patricia Summers completed her probation without incident and, as far as I knew, stayed out of trouble. I bore her no ongoing ill will. She had done terrible things and she had faced consequences. That was enough. I didn't need her to be destroyed, just held accountable. The justice system had worked, imperfectly but adequately. The real victory wasn't the money or the media attention or even the legislative changes, though those all mattered. The real victory was that I could stand on my dock, look at my boathouse, and know that I had fought for what was right and won. Not just for me, but for everyone who came after. One evening in late summer, I was grilling dinner on my deck when Marcus stopped by. He had remained not just my attorney, but a good friend. We had been through something intense together, and that created a bond. "Got a new case I wanted to run by you," Marcus said, accepting a beer. HOA in Asheville trying to foreclose on a disabled veteran over unpaid fines. The fines are for him parking his accessible van in his driveway instead of the garage, because the garage is too small for the van. That's outrageous, right? I'm taking the case pro bono, but I wanted to see if you'd be willing to talk to the veteran, share your experience. I think it would help him feel less alone in this. Absolutely. Send me his contact information. Marcus raised his beer. You know, when you first came to my office 3 years ago, I thought this would be a straightforward HOA dispute. Maybe a settlement, maybe a quick trial. I never imagined it would turn into all this. I clinked my bottle against his. Neither did I. I just wanted my boathouse back. And now you're a national advocate for HOA reform. You've helped change laws in multiple states, and you've assisted hundreds of homeowners in fighting back against abuse. Funny how life works out. It's more than that, Marcus said. You turned something terrible into something meaningful. A lot of people would have just taken a settlement and tried to forget the whole thing. You kept fighting. I had a lot of help. You, Howard, Jennifer Walsh, Representative Monroe, everyone who stood up and told the truth. True, but you were the catalyst. You refused to accept what happened to you, and that made all the difference. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching boats drift across the lake in the fading light. The new boathouse stood silhouettely against the sunset, a monument to persistence and principle. Later that night, after Marcus left, I went down to the dock and sat at the edge, feet dangling over the water. My phone buzzed with an email notification. Another homeowner, this time in Oregon, facing foreclosure over their HOA's attempt to ban backyard chicken coops after the homeowner had already built one with proper permits. I'd respond in the morning, offer whatever guidance I could, connect them with resources. It never really ended. As long as there were HOAs with unchecked power and leaders who abused that power, there would be homeowners who needed help. I couldn't save everyone, but I could do my part. I thought about what my grandfather would have said about all this. He had been a union organizer in the textile mills of North Carolina, fighting for workers' rights in the face of corporate indifference. He had taught me that standing up to power was hard but necessary, that justice didn't happen by accident, and that good people had an obligation to help those who couldn't help themselves. He would have been proud, I thought. Proud that I fought back. Proud that I used my experience to help others. Proud that I didn't let the bastards win. The tackle box he had given me, the one I had retrieved from the water after the demolition, sat on a shelf in the new boathouse, carefully restored. Every time I saw it, I remembered why all of this mattered. I pulled out my phone and responded to the email from Oregon, offering to connect them with a lawyer I knew in Portland and providing some strategic advice based on what had worked in my case. Then I forwarded their story to Representative Monroe's office, flagging it as another example of why federal HOA reform was needed. Small actions, but they added up. That was the thing I had learned through all of this. Change didn't happen through one dramatic moment. It happened through countless small acts of courage, people deciding to stand up and say, "No, this isn't right," and refusing to back down. My phone buzzed again. A text from Bethany Kowalski, the teacher from across the lake who had been fighting over solar panels. "Wanted to let you know, our HOA president just resigned. Turns out he'd been embezzling community funds. Our treasurer found it during an audit we pushed for after our case settled. He's being prosecuted. Thank you for encouraging us to keep pushing for accountability." I smiled and replied, "That's fantastic news. Congratulations on the win. Keep fighting the good fight." The night air was cooling, and I headed back to the house. Tomorrow was Saturday, and I planned to take the boat out early, do some fishing, enjoy the peace I had fought so hard to preserve. But tonight, I felt satisfied. Not just with the outcome of my own case, but with what had come from it. $40,000 in 2 years of my life to learn that you can fight City Hall, or in this case, the HOA. That justice, while slow and expensive, was possible. That standing up for your rights, even when it felt impossible, could lead to changes that helped thousands of people you'd never meet. The boathouse stood at the end of my dock, exactly 23 feet tall, fully legal, and absolutely perfect. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was proof that doing the right thing, no matter how difficult, was always worth it. And if Patricia Summers or anyone like her ever tried something like this again, they'd find the playing field had changed. The laws were stronger, the penalties were harsher, and there was a network of people ready to fight back. I turned off the lights and headed to bed, sleeping soundly for the first time in years, knowing that my home was safe, my rights were protected, and the boathouse that had caused so much trouble was exactly where it belonged, standing tall and defiant on the shores of Lake Norman.